Most people imagine the world of Jesus as a purely spiritual landscape, a land of sandals and sermons, parables and miracles, suspended somewhere outside normal history, a distant moral stage where eternal questions mattered more than material reality. But for the people who actually lived there, daily life was not organized around theology. It was organized around survival, and survival was dictated by money, scarcity, and debt. The world into which the historical figure of Jesus was born was shaped by one of the most unequal economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever produced. This was not an accidental imbalance. It was a deliberate design. Judea, at the dawn of the 1st century, sat firmly inside the Roman Empire, a political structure that functioned less like a civilization and more like a vast extraction engine. Rome did not conquer territories to develop them. It conquered them to finance itself. Provinces existed to move wealth outward. Grain, silver, labor, and taxes flowed from the edges of the empire toward the imperial core. Judea was one of those edges, and Judea was not rich. It was overwhelmingly rural, fragile, and dependent on agriculture. Most people lived on small plots of land, barely large enough to sustain a family. These were not profit-generating farms, they were survival units. A single failed harvest did not mean reduced income, it meant hunger. And Rome did not adjust its demands for hunger. Taxes were owed regardless of outcome. Rome governed Judea through a combination of local elites and imperial administrators. Client kings such as Herod the Great ruled with Roman approval. After his death, Roman prefects, including figures like Pontius Pilate, took direct control. Their mandate was simple: maintain order, ensure revenue. Improving living standards was not part of the job description. The tax system was the backbone of this arrangement, and it was ruthless in its simplicity. Unlike modern taxation, which is at least nominally tied to income or profit, Roman taxation in Judea was owed simply because you existed. There were land taxes, produce taxes, head taxes, tolls on roads and markets. On top of imperial taxes came religious obligations. Miss a payment, and there was no bureaucratic delay, no appeals process, no negotiated settlement. Tax collection was outsourced to local contractors known as tax farmers. They paid Rome upfront for the right to collect, then extracted as much as possible to recover their investment and generate profit. Excess was not punished, it was expected. If a household could not pay, it borrowed. Debt saturated the economy, but this was not modern debt with safeguards and restructuring. There was no bankruptcy protection, no legal reset. Interest accumulated quickly, and land was the collateral. A single bad year could trigger a downward spiral that no amount of labor could reverse. A failed harvest led to borrowing. Borrowing led to interest. Interest led to seizure. Families lost land that had been in their possession for generations. Former owners became tenants. Tenants became laborers. Many disappeared entirely from the records. This process was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. Over time, land consolidated into fewer and fewer hands. Small plots vanished. Large estates emerged, owned by elites tied to Roman authority and temple administration. Wealth pooled upward. Insecurity spread downward. The economy did not merely produce poverty, it reproduced it, relentlessly, across generations. And there was no state safety net to soften the fall. Lose your land, and you lost more than income. You lost status, identity, and future security. Families were the only buffer, and even they could only absorb so much pressure. Community charity existed, but it was limited and inconsistent. When too many people fell at once, the system offered nothing in return. Debt was not just financial, it was social and psychological. It reshaped how people understood themselves and their place in the world. This is the economic reality into which Jesus was born. And it matters to say this plainly. Most people were not poor because they were lazy, immoral, or cursed. They were poor because the system required them to be. Rome required surplus. Local elites required rent. Religious institutions required revenue. All of that pressure converged on people with the least margin for error. The result was instability. Judea was not peaceful. It was volatile. Rebellions flared with regularity. Banditry was widespread, not as random crime, but as economic desperation. Groups emerged promising relief, justice, reversal. Messianic movements did not arise in comfort. They arose in collapse. When people listened to sermons about forgiveness, release, and justice, they were not hearing abstractions. They were hearing survival strategies. Forgiveness meant debt cancellation. Release meant escape. The poor were not a distant category. They were neighbors, family members, and often oneself. Rome tolerated suffering. What it demanded was order. Stability mattered more than fairness. Revenue mattered more than lives. Productivity did not translate into security. Growth lifted a few and crushed the rest. Everyone understood this. There was no illusion that hard work guaranteed safety. There was only endurance, resentment, and the fragile hope that something might break the cycle. To understand why this pressure felt inescapable, you have to examine the institution people believed was meant to protect them, the temple in Jerusalem. Today, it is often imagined as a purely religious space. In reality, it was one of the most powerful financial institutions in the region. The temple was sacred, but it was also a treasury, a bank, a tax authority, and a court. These roles were inseparable. Every adult Jewish male was required to pay an annual temple tax. This obligation was enforced. It had to be paid in a specific silver coin, the Tyrian shekel, chosen for its consistent silver content. Local currencies were not accepted. Roman coins were not accepted. Money had to be exchanged. Money changes facilitated this process. For a fee, vendors sold sacrificial animals at temple-approved prices. Pilgrims traveling for festivals had no alternative. Even the poor paid. They paid in smaller offerings, but they still paid. Religious obligation did not replace Roman taxation. It compounded it. And the temple elite were deeply entangled with Roman power. High priests were not selected by popular support or moral authority. They were appointed with Roman approval. Stability mattered more than righteousness. Cooperation mattered more than justice. The institution that claimed moral authority benefited from the same extraction logic that impoverished the population. This contradiction did not go unnoticed. Resentment toward temple authorities grew, not because people rejected faith, but because they saw hypocrisy. Holiness was preached, but debt was enforced. Forgiveness was proclaimed, but access required payment. Charity treated symptoms. It did not undo land loss or cancel obligations. This is the system Jesus spoke into. When he talked about debt forgiveness, his audience heard economics. When he talked about release, they heard relief. When he spoke of the poor, they saw themselves. And when he spoke of the kingdom of God, they did not hear abstraction. They heard the possibility of a different order. Jesus did not attack Rome directly. That would have ended quickly. Instead, he undermined legitimacy. He reframed value. He challenged who deserved authority and why. His teachings were saturated with economic language because economics dominated daily life. Creditors, wages, laborers, vineyards, masters, stewards. These were not metaphors chosen for convenience. They were chosen because they exposed inequality. The confrontation reached its breaking point in the temple. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, it was not a rejection of money itself. It was an attack on the machinery that monetized access to the sacred. Calling it a den of robbers was an accusation of systemic exploitation. This crossed a line. Rome tolerated prophets. It tolerated teachers. What it did not tolerate was instability. Temple authorities understood the danger. Passover meant crowds. Crowds plus grievance meant rebellion. From their perspective, Jesus was not just preaching. He was disrupting flows. He was challenging legitimacy. He was threatening the balance that kept Rome satisfied and local elites in power. The conflict was not primarily theological. It was economic and political. Systems can absorb suffering. They struggle when people begin to question why suffering exists and whether it is necessary. Once debt stops feeling like destiny, extraction becomes harder to enforce. Within a generation, Judea erupted into open revolt. In 66 CE, rebellion broke out. By 70, Jerusalem was under siege. The temple was destroyed stone by stone. Its treasury was looted, its hierarchy erased. Rome responded as it always did, decisively, violently, efficiently. The destruction of the temple did not end extraction, it streamlined it. Roman taxation intensified, land consolidation accelerated. Debt became more bureaucratic, more absolute. In the short term, Rome won. But control of territory is not the same as control of meaning. Jesus had not led an army. He had not promised administrative reform. He challenged something deeper, the moral logic that made extraction feel inevitable and divinely sanctioned. By separating debt from moral failure, by offering forgiveness outside institutional payment, by placing the poor at the center rather than the margins, he destabilized the foundation of legitimacy itself. Empires can survive resentment. They can survive rebellion. What they struggle to survive is disbelief. After the temple fell, the critique did not vanish. Small communities emerged operating on different assumptions, shared resources, mutual aid. Debt relief within the group. These were not revolutions. They were parallel moral economies. Rome crushed armed resistance quickly. This challenge was harder to extinguish because it required no territory, no temple, no treasury. It moved with people. It survived loss. Over time, Rome absorbed it, conceding something profound. Authority could no longer rest on force alone. Moral credibility mattered. The economy of Jesus' time reveals an uncomfortable truth. Systems do not collapse simply because they are unjust. They collapse when the stories that justify them stop working. Rome perfected extraction. It never repaired the moral breach that made domination feel natural. Economic systems wrapped in moral language are durable. They survive hardship and rebellion. What they do not survive is widespread refusal to believe that suffering is necessary or deserved. History does not repeat, but it exposes patterns. And once you see how power defends itself with stories as much as with force, those stories become much harder to accept.